Section 32 of The Best Short Stories of 1917. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Betty B. The Best Short Stories of 1917 by Various. The Best Books of Short Stories of 1917. A Critical Analysis. Christmas Tales of Flanders, illustrated by Jean de Beauchère, Dodd, Mead and Company. If you like Andersen's fairy tales, here is a book which comes as truly from the heart of a people. Many old folk legends are here set down just as they came from the lips of old people in Flanders, and as they have never grown old in that countryside, let us hope that they will take root equally well here. The volume is superbly illustrated with many pictures from the whimsical fancy of Jean de Beauchère. These pictures are indescribable, but they will rejoice the heart of any child, old or young. From Death to Life by A. Apuktin, translated by R. Frank and E. Huybers. R. Frank. This story, which so happily inaugurates a series of translations from Russian literature, is a poetic study in life after death, chronicling the experiences of a soul between death and rebirth. The translators have succeeded in reflecting successfully the fine, imaginative style of this prose poem, which deserves to be widely known. It tempts us to wish that other stories by Apuktin may soon find an English translator. Tales of the Revolution by Michael Artsobachev, translated by Percy Pinkerton. B. W. Hubish. The 5 tales by Artsobachev included in this volume all have the same quality of bitter irony and mordant self-analysis. The psychological revelation of the mind that has made the later phases of the present Russian Revolution possible is complete, and I know of no book that presents more clearly and truthfully the rudderless pessimism of these particular spiritual reactions. Such courageous dissection of the diseased mind has never been undertaken in American or English fiction, and though its realism is appalling, it is healthful in its naked frankness. The Friends by Stacy Ammonier. The Century Company. When The Friends was published 2 years ago in the Century magazine, it was evident at once that an important new short story writer had arrived. The homely humanity of his characterization was but the evidence of a rich, imaginative talent that found self-expression in the more quiet ways of life. I said at the time that I believed The Friends to be one of the 2 best short stories of 1915, and others felt it to be the best story of the year. To The Friends have now been added in this volume 2 other stories of almost equal distinction, The Packet and In the Way of Business. While Mr. Ammonier has a certain didactic intention in these stories, he has kept it entirely subordinate to the artistry of his exposition, and it is the few characters which he has added to English fiction that we remember after his somewhat obvious moral has been conveyed. His short stories have the same flavor of belated Victorianism that one enjoys in the novels of William de Morgan, and he is equally noteworthy in his chosen field. Irish Idylls by Jane Barlow, Dodd, Mead and Company. This new edition of Irish Idylls should introduce the admirable studies of Miss Barlow to a new audience that may not be familiar with what was a pioneer volume in its day. Published in 1893, it almost marked the beginning of the Irish literary movement, and so many fine writers followed Miss Barlow that she has been most unfairly concealed by their shadows. Her studies of the lives and deaths, joys and sorrows of Connemara peasants are none the less real because they are the product of observation by one who did not live among them. They show, as Miss Barlow says, that there are plenty of things beside turf to be found in a bog. It is true that they represent a slight spirit of condescension, entirely absent from the work of Padraic Colum, for instance, but they approach far more closely to the heart of the Irish fishermen and farmers than the work of any other English type of mind, and although Miss Barlow is best known today by her poetry, I have always felt that she conveyed more poetry into Irish Idylls than into any other of her books. The volume is a necessary and permanent addition to any small collection of modern Irish literature. Day and Night Stories by Algernon Blackwood. E. P. Dutton and Company. In these 15 short stories, Mr. Blackwood has adequately maintained the quality of his best previous animistic work. To those who found a new imaginative world in The Centaur and Pan's Garden, the old familiar magic still has power in many of these stories, almost completely in The Touch of Pan and Initiation. Hardly inferior to these stories for their passionate reality are The Other Wing, The Occupant of the Room, The Tryst, and H.S.H. There is no story in this volume which would not have made the reputation of a new writer, and I can hardly find a better introduction than Day and Night Stories to the beauty of Mr. Blackwood's imaginative life. He serves the same altar of beauty in our day that John Keats served a century ago, and I cannot but believe that his magic will gain greater poignancy as generations pass. The Derelict by Phyllis Bottom. The Century Company. This collection of Miss Bottom's short stories, many of which have previously appeared in the Century magazine during the past 2 years, gives a more complete revelation of her talent than either of her novels. I suspect that the short story is her true literary medium, and certainly there are at least 6 of these 8 short stories which I should be compelled to list with 3 stars in my annual roll of honor. In subject and mood they range from tragedy to social comedy. Elsewhere in this volume I have discussed Ironstone, which seems to me the best of these stories. A subtle irony pervades them, but it is so definitely concealed that its insistence is never evident. Old Christmas and Other Kentucky Tales in Verse by William Aspinwall Bradley. The Houghton Mifflin Company. In this series of vignettes in verse, Mr. Bradley has presented the Kentucky mountaineer as imaginatively as Robert Frost has presented the farmer folk of New Hampshire in North of Boston and Mountain Interval. The racy humor of these narratives is thoroughly indigenous, and Mr. Bradley's work has a vivid dramatic power which challenges successfully a comparison with the stories of John Fox Jr. These poems prove Mr. Bradley's rightful claim to be the first adequate imaginative interpreter of the people who live in the Cumberland Mountains. The Fighting Men by Alden Brooks, Charles Scribner's Sons. Of these 6 stories, 4 have been published in Collier's Weekly during the past 2 years, and elsewhere I have had occasion to comment upon their excellence. These narratives may be regarded as separate cantos of a war epic, which is fairly comparable for its vividness of portrayal to Stephen Crane's masterpiece, The Red Badge of Courage. Few writers other than these 2 have been able to portray the naked ugliness of warfare, and the passions which warfare engenders, with more brutal power. Time alone will tell whether these stories have a chance of permanence, but I am disposed to rank them with that other portrait of the mercilessness of war, Under Fire by Henri Barbusse. Limehouse Nights by Thomas Burke, Robert M. McBride and Company. These colorful stories of life in London's Chinatown are, in my humble belief, destined never to grow old. This volume is the most important volume of short stories by a new English writer to appear during 1917, and is only surpassed by Daniel Corkery's volume, A Munster Twilight. Such pattern prose in fiction has not been known since the days of Walter Pater, and Mr. Burke's sense of the almost intolerable beauty of ugly things has a persuasive fascination for the reader who may have a strong prejudice against his subjects. Such horror as Mr. Burke has imagined is almost impossible to portray convincingly, yet the author has softened its starkness into patterns of gracious beauty and musical rhythmic speech. Rinconete and Cortadillo by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra, translated from the Spanish by Mariano J. Lorente, with a preface by R. B. Cunninghame Graham, The Four Seas Company. This is an excellent translation by a Spanish man of letters of what is perhaps the best exemplary novel by Cervantes. As Mr. Cunninghame Graham points out in his delightful introduction, Rinconete and Cortadillo is perhaps the best sketch of Spanish low life that has come down to us. It is highly amoral despite its subtitle, and all the more delightful perhaps on that account. I hope that the translator may be persuaded, if the volume goes into the second edition it so richly deserves, to omit his very contentious preface, which can be of interest only to himself and to other people. Then our delight in this volume would be complete. The Duel, Macmillan. The House with the Mezzanine, Scribner. The Lady with the Dog, Macmillan. The Party, Macmillan, and Rothschild's Fiddle, Bonney and Liveright, by Anton Chekhov. To The Darling, which was the first volume, so far as I know, of Chekhov, to be presented to the American public. 5 new collections of Chekhov's tales have been added during the past year in excellent English renderings. 3 of these volumes are translated by Constance Garnett, whose superb translations of Turgenev and Dostoevsky are well known to American readers. Because Chekhov ranks with Poe and de Maupassant as one of the 3 supreme masters of the short story, it is a matter of signal importance that these translations should appear, and in them every mood of Russian life is reflected with subtle artistry and a passionate reality of creative vision. Chekhov is destined to exert greater and greater influence on the American short story as the translations of his work increase, and these 5 volumes prove him to be fully equal to Dostoevsky in sustained and varied spiritual observation. These stories range through the entire gamut of human emotion, from sublime tragedy to the richest and most golden comedy. If I were to choose a single author of short stories from my library on a desert island, my choice would inevitably turn to these volumes. Those Times and These, by Irvin S. Cobb, George H. Durand Company. This is quite the best volume of short stories that Mr. Cobb has yet published. Since The Escape of Mr. Trim, which was his first short story, was printed in the Saturday Evening Post 7 years ago, Mr. Cobb's literary development has been rapid, if not sure, but he may now with this volume lay claim fairly to the mantle of Mark Twain for the rich humanity with which he has endowed his substance and the inimitable humor of his characterizations. In The Family Tree and Cinnamon Seed and Sandy Bottom, Mr. Cobb has added 2 stories of permanent value to American literature, and in Mr. Felsberg Gets Even and There Was Light, Mr. Cobb's literary art is almost as well sustained. My only quarrel with him in this book is for the inclusion of A Kiss for Kindness, where a fine short story possibility seems to have been entirely missed by the author, perhaps because, as he ingenuously confessed shortly afterward, he had just become an abandoned farmer. Running Free by James B. Connolly, Charles Scribner's Sons. Of the 10 short stories included by Mr. Connolly in this collection, 4 are among the best he has ever written. Breath o' Dawn, The Sea Birds, The Medicine Ship, and One Wireless Night. With the simplicity of speech which characterizes all of Mr. Connolly's work, he relates his story for the story's sake. Because he is an Irishman, he is an incorrigible romancist, and I suspect that characterization interests him for the story's sake rather than for itself alone. But now that Richard Harding Davis is dead, I suppose that James B. Connolly may fairly take his place as our best born yarner, with all a yarner's privileges. T.P. Neighbors by Grace Coolidge, The Four Seas Company. This quiet little book of narratives and Indian portraits by Miss Coolidge deserves more attention than it has yet received, and for its qualities of quiet pathos and sympathetic insight into the Indian character, I associate it as of equal value with Margaret Prescott Montague's stories of blind children in West Virginia. A Munster Twilight by Daniel Corkery, Frederick A. Stokes Company. I have never read a new volume of short stories with such a sense of discovery as I felt when these tales came to my hand. Because the volume appears to have attracted absolutely no attention as yet in this country, I wish to emphasize my firm belief that this is the most memorable volume of short stories published in English within the past 5 years. It makes us eager to read Mr. Corkery's new novel, The Threshold of Quiet, in order that we may see if such a glorious imaginative sweep can be maintained in a novel as the reader will find in any single short story of this volume. Here you will find the very heart of Ireland's spiritual adventure revealed in folk speech of inevitable beauty. There is not a story in the book which does not disclose new aspects after repeated readings. A craftsmanship so fine and vigorous is seldom related with such artistic humility. A Munster Twilight proves that there are still great men in Ireland. Brought Forward: Faith, Hope, Charity, Progress, and Success by R. B. Cunninghame Graham, Frederick A. Stokes Company. It is an extraordinary fact that a short story writer so deservedly well known in England as Mr. Cunninghame Graham, whose sketches of life in many parts of the globe have been published at frequent intervals through the past decade, is yet entirely unknown in this country. To be sure, such has been the fate of W. H. Hudson until very recently. These 6 volumes certainly rank, by virtue of the quality of their style and the imaginative reality of their substance, with the best work of Mr. Hudson, and the parallel is the more complete because both writers have made the vanished life of the South American plains real to the English mind. Mr. Cunninghame Graham is one of the great travel writers, and ranks with Borrow and Ford, but he is more impartially interested in character than either Borrow or Ford, and has a far more vivid feeling for the spiritual values of landscape. It may be that these stories are for the few only, but I am loath to believe it. The life of the Pampas and the life of the Moroccan desert live in these pages with an actuality as great as the life of the American plains lives in the work of Hamlin Garland, and there is an epic sweep in Mr. Cunninghame Graham's vision that I find in no other contemporary English writer. The Echo of Voices by Richard Curle, Alfred A. Knopf. It is very rarely that a disciple as faithful as Mr. Curle publishes a volume which his master would be proud to sign, but I think that the reader will detect in this book the authentic voice of Joseph Conrad. Mr. Conrad's own personal enthusiasm for the book is an ingratiating introduction to the reader, but in these 8 stories Mr. Curle can certainly afford to stand alone. Preoccupied as he is with the mystery of human existence and the effect of circumstance upon the character, he portrays 8 widely different human types, almost all of them with a certain pathetic futility of aspect, so surely and finely that they live before us. It is an interesting fact that the 3 best short story books in English of 1917 come from the other side of the water. Limehouse Nights, A Munster Twilight, and The Echo of Voices make this year so memorable in fiction that later years may well prove disappointing. The Eternal Husband and Other Stories, and The Gambler and Other Stories by Fyodor Dostoevsky, the Macmillan Company. These 2 new volumes contain the complete English edition of Dostoevsky, which is being translated by Constant Garnett. The renderings have the same qualities of idiomatic speech and subtly rendered nuance which is always to be found in this translator's work, and although both of these volumes represent the minor work of Dostoevsky, his minor work is finer than our major work, and characterized by a passionate curiosity about the human soul, and a deep insight into its mysteries. It is idle to argue as to whether these narratives are short stories or brief novels. However we classify them, they are profound revelations of human relationship, and place their author among the great masters of the world's literature. Nor is it pertinent to discuss their technique or lack of it. Their technique is sufficient for the author's purpose, and he has achieved his will nobly in a manner inevitable to him. Billy Topsail, M.D., by Norman Duncan, Fleming H. Revell Company. In this posthumous volume Norman Duncan has woven together a selection of his later short stories, in which further adventures of Dr. Luke of the Labrador are chronicled. They represent the very best of his later work, and in them the stern physical conditions with which nature surrounds the life of man provide an admirably rendered background for the portrayal of character developed by circumstance. Norman Duncan can never have a successor, and in Billy Topsail, M.D., the reader will find him very nearly at his best. My People by Caradoc Evans, Duffield and Company. My People is a record of the peasantry of West Wales, and these chronicles are set down with a biblical economy of speech that makes for a noteworthy literary style. I refuse to believe that they are a truthful portrait of the folk of whom Mr. Evans writes, but I believe that he has created a real subjective world of his own that is thoroughly convincing. H. G. Wells has written eulogistically of the book and also of the author's novel, Capel's Scion. I appreciate the qualities in the book that have won Mr. Wells' esteem, and the book is indeed memorable, but I believe that its excellence is an artificial excellence, and I commend it to the reader as a work of incomparable artifice rather than as a faithful reflection of life. In Happy Valley by John Fox, Jr., Charles Scribner's Sons. Of these 10 new chronicles of the Kentucky mountains, gathered from the pages of Scribner's Magazine during the past year, for the most part, his Last Christmas Gift is the most memorable. But all the stories are brief and vivid vignettes of the countryside which Mr. Fox knows so well, told with the utmost economy of speech and with a fine sense of atmospheric values. These stories are a happy illustration of the better regionalism that is characteristic of contemporary American fiction, and like Almorandy will prove valuable records to a later generation of a life that even now is rapidly passing away. The War, Madam, by Paul Géraldy, Charles Scribner's Sons. The delicate fantasy of this little story only enhances the poignant tragedy that it discloses. Somehow it suggests a comparison with 4 Days by Hetty Hemingway, although it is told with greater deftness and a more subtle irony. In these pages pulses the very heart of France, and it is compact of the spirit that has made France a mistress to die for. The translation is admirable. Collected Poems by Wilfred Wilson Gibson, The Macmillan Company. In these noble studies of English social life among the laboring classes, Mr. Gibson has collected all of his stories in verse which he wishes to retain in his collected works. He has already become an influence on the work of many of his contemporaries, and the qualities of incisive observation, warm humanity, and subtle art which characterize his best work are adequately disclosed in his poems. I am sure that the reader of short stories will find them as fascinating as any volume of prose published this year, and the sum of all these poems is an English comédie humaine, which portrays every type of English labor in rich, imaginative speech. The dramatic quality of these stories is achieved by virtue of a constant economy of selection and a nervous singing speech as authentic as that of Synge. Almorandy by Armistead C. Gordon, Charles Scribner's Sons. In this collection Mr. Gordon, whose name is so happily associated with that of Thomas Nelson Page, has collected from the files of Scribner's Magazine the deft and insinuating chronicles of Negro life on a Virginia plantation, which have attracted so much favorable comment in recent years. This collection places Mr. Gordon in the same rank as the author of Marse Chan as a literary artist of the vanished South. These transcripts from the folk life of the people are told very quietly in a persuasive style that reveals a rich, poetic sense of human values. The mellow atmosphere of these stories is particularly noteworthy, and Mr. Gordon's instinctive sympathy with his subject has saved him from that spirit of condescension which has been the weakness of so much American folk writing in the past. Almorandy will long remain a happy and honorable tradition in American literature. The Grim 13, edited by Frederick Stewart Green, Dodd, Mead and Company, is a collection of 13 stories of literary value which have been declined with enthusiastic praise by the editors of American magazines because of their grim quality or because they have an extremely unhappy ending. The collection was gathered as a test of the public interest, in order to remove, if possible, what the editor believed to be a false editorial policy. It is interesting to examine these stories and to pretend that one is an editor. The experiment has been extremely successful and has produced at least one story by an American author, The Abigail Sheriff Memorial by Vincent O'Sullivan, and one story by an English author, Old Fags by Stacy Ammonier, which are permanent in their literary value. 4 Days, The Story of a War Marriage by Hetty Hemingway, Little, Brown and Company. Of this story I have spoken elsewhere in this volume. I shall only add here that it is one of the most significant spiritual studies in fiction that the war has produced, and that it is directly told in a style of sensitive beauty. A Diversity of Creatures by Rudyard Kipling, Doubleday, Page and Company, is the first collection of Mr. Kipling's short stories published in several years. I must confess frankly that there is but one story in the volume which seems to me a completely realized rendering of the substance which Mr. Kipling has chosen, and that is the incomparable satire on publicity entitled The Village That Voted the Earth Was Flat. In this volume you will find many stories in many moods, and some of them are postscripts to earlier volumes of Mr. Kipling. I cannot believe that his war stories deserve as high praise as they have been accorded. This volume presents Mr. Kipling as the most consummate living master of technique in the English tongue, but his inspiration has failed him except for the single exception which I have chronicled. The volume is a memory rather than an actuality, and it has the pathos of a forgotten dream. The Bracelet of Garnets and Other Stories by Alexander Kuprin, translated by Leo Paswalski, with an introduction by William Lyon Phelps, Charles Scribner's Sons. This collection of stories is based on the author's own selection for this purpose, and although the translation is not thoroughly idiomatic, the sheer poetry of Kuprin's imagination shines through the veil of an alien speech and captures the imagination of the reader. Kuprin's pictorial sense is curiously similar to that of Wilbur Daniel Steele, and it is interesting to study the reactions of similar temperaments on widely different substances and backgrounds. Kuprin achieves a chiseled finality of utterance which is as evident in his tragedy as in his comedy, and in some of these pieces a fine allegorical beauty shines prismatically through a carefully economized brilliance of narrative. The Prussian Officer and Other Stories by D.H. Lawrence. B. W. Hubish. The 12 short stories collected in this volume are full of the same warm color that one always associates with Mr. Lawrence's best work, and the nervous complaining beauty of his style makes him the English compeer of Gabriel D'Annunzio. The warm, lush fragrance of many European countrysides pervades these stories, and a certain poignant sensual disillusionment is insistently stressed by the characters who flit through the shadowy foreground. It is the definitely realized and concrete sense of landscape that Mr. Lawrence has achieved which is his finest artistic attribute, and the sensitive response to light which is so characteristic an element in his vision bathes all the pictures he presents in a rich glow, whose gradations of light and shadow respond finely to the emotional reactions of his characters. He is the most sophisticated of the contemporary English realists, and has the sense of poetry to a high degree which is conspicuously absent in the work of other English novelists. A Designer of Dawns and Other Tales by Gertrude Russell Lewis, Pilgrim Press. I set this volume of allegories beside Flame and the Shadow Eater by Henrietta Weaver as one of the two best books of allegories published in 1917. These 7 little tales have a quiet, imaginative glow that is very appealing, and I find in them a folk quality that is almost Scandinavian in its naivete. The Terror, a Mystery by Arthur Machen, Robert M. McBride and Company. When this story was first published in the Century magazine in 1917, under the title of The Coming of the Terror, it was at once hailed by discriminating readers as the best short story by an English writer published in an American magazine since The Friends by Stacy Ammonier. It is now published in its complete form as originally written, and although it is as long as a short novel, it has an essential unity of incident which justifies us in claiming it as a short story. I suppose that Algernon Blackwood is the only other English writer who has the same gift for making strange spiritual adventures completely real to the imagination, and the author of The Bowmen has surpassed even that fine story in this description of how a mysterious terror overran England during the last years of the Great War, and how the mystery of its passing was finally revealed. The emotional tension of the reader is enhanced by the quiet, matter-of-fact air with which the story is presented. The volume is one of the best 5 or 6 books of short stories which England has produced during the past year. The Second Odd Number, 13 Tales by Guy de Maupassant. The translation by Charles Henry White, an introduction by William Dean Howells, Harper and Brothers. It is reported in some volume of French literary memoirs that Guy de Maupassant regarded the first series of The Odd Number as better than the original. Be this as it may, the 13 stories which make up this volume are admirably rendered with a careful reflection of the slightest nuances. As Mr. Howells states in his introduction to the volume, the range of these stories is not very great. The effect they make is greater than the range. But this selection has been admirably chosen with a view to making the range as wide as possible, and I can only hope that it will serve to influence some of our younger writers toward a greater descriptive and emotional economy. The Girl and the Faun by Eden Phillpotts, J.B. Lippincott Company. These 8 idyls of the 4 seasons are graceful Greek legends told with a modern touch in poetic prose. They have a quality of quiet beauty which will commend them to many readers to whom the more realistic work of Mr. Phillpotts does not appeal, and the admirable illustrations by Frank Brangwyn are a felicitous accompaniment to the modulated prose of Mr. Phillpotts. Barbed Wire and Other Poems by Edwin Ford Piper, The Midland Press, Moorhead, Minnesota. As Grant Showerman's A Country Chronicle is an admirable rendering of the farm life of Wisconsin in the 70s, so these poems are a fine, imaginative record of the pioneer life of Nebraska a little later. I believe this volume to contain quite as fine poetry as Robert Frost's North of Boston. Here you will meet many men and women struggling against the loneliness of prairie life, and winning spiritual as well as material conquests out of nature. The greater part of this volume is composed of a series of narrative poems entitled The Neighborhood. Their lack of literary sophistication is part of their charm, and the calculated ruggedness of the author's style is a faithful reflection of his barren physical background. Best Russian Short Stories, compiled and edited by Thomas Seltzer, Bonney and Liverite. This is the first anthology of Russian short stories which has yet been published in English, and the selections are excellent. There is a wide range of literary art represented in this volume, and the translations are extremely smooth and idiomatic. As is only fitting, the work of Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Turgenev, and other Russians, whose work is already well known to the American reader, are only represented lightly in the collection, and greater space is devoted to the stories of Chekhov and other writers less familiar to the American public. 19 stories are translated from the work of Pushkin, Gogol, Turgenev, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Saltykov, Korolenko, Garshin, Chekhov, Sologub, Potapenko, Semyonov, Gorky, Andreev, Artzybashev, and Kuprin, and the volume is prefixed with an excellent critical introduction by the editor. A Country Child by Grant Showerman. The Century Company. This is a sequel to Professor Showerman's earlier volume, A Country Chronicle. The book is an epic of what a little boy saw and felt and dreamed on a farm in Wisconsin 40 years ago, told just as a little boy would tell it. It will help you to remember how you went to the circus and how you stayed up late on your birthday. You will also recall the ball game the day you didn't go home from school, and how you went in swimming, and about that fight with Bill, and ever so many other things which you thought that you had forgotten. I think all the boys and girls that used to write to James Whitcomb Riley should send a birthday letter this year to Grant Showerman, so that he will get it on the 9th of January. Let's start a movement in Wisconsin to have a Showerman Day. Flame and the Shadow Eater by Henrietta Weaver, Henry Holt and Company. In these 15 short allegorical tales, Henrietta Weaver has introduced with considerable skill much Persian philosophy, and presented it to the American reader so attractively that it is thoroughly persuasive. Akin in a measure to certain similar stories by Jeanette Marks, they have the same prismatic quality of brilliance and impermanence. I do not believe that the reader who enjoys the poetry of the mind will find these allegories specially esoteric, but I may commend them frankly for their story value, irrespective of the symbols which the author has chosen to attach to them. The Great Modern French Stories, edited by Willard Huntington Wright, Bonney and Leverett, Married by August Strindberg, Bonney and Leverett, and Visions by Count Ilya Tolstoy, James B. Pond, have reached me too late for extended review. I list them here as 3 volumes of permanent literary value. End of section 32.